We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Gimel Amud Beis in Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma, Daf 103b. The Mishnah continues, Harezem Mishalim Chomesh al Chomesh. Again, the case is, let's say a person pays off the Karen, he pays off the principal, but then on the fifth that he's supposed to pay, because again, this is talking about a situation where he stole and then he swore falsely about it, then admitted. So the halacha is you have to pay Karen Chomesh and bring a Karban Asham. But then what happened was that on the fifth, he swore falsely about the fifth, and then he admitted about that, so now he has to pay a fifth on that fifth. Ad Sheyismayit HaKaren, and that keeps going until the principal, it really means the new principal, until that fifth that you're swearing falsely about. If that gets so small, Mishava Pruta, if that's smaller than a Pruta, so then already there's no halach anymore of paying a fifth on less than a Shava Pruta. And the Mishnah continues, V'chein b'pikadon. The same halach applies by a pikadon. In other words, when a person swears falsely and then admits that they swore falsely about it, it's not only when you steal something, it's really any kind of money that is owed that you swear falsely about and then you admit that you swore falsely. There's a halach of a fifth and a halacha of an asham. Shenemar, like it says in the pasuk, b'pikadon, o b'sesum esyad, o b'gazel, o ashak esami. So all different kinds of monetary obligations, whether it's a pikadon, whether it's a loan, whether the person stole from the person, o matzah aveda v'kichesh, let's say the person found something and then he denied it, Benishva al sheker, in all of these situations, if he swears falsely, then we have these halachas of Harezim Mishalim, Karen v'chomesh v'asham. Then the halach is he has to pay the Karen, he has to pay the fifth, and he has to bring the Karban Asham. And Rashi explains a couple of the terms of the pasuk. O ashak esamiso refers specifically to schar sachir. The person withholds the wages from somebody. To sum esyad, as we said, is halva, that refers to a loan. And the Gemara infers from the Mishnah, nishba lo in. It's only true if he swears to him, so then he has to go follow him even to Marai to return it. But lo nishba lo, but if he doesn't take the oath, again, take a false oath and then admit, so then he doesn't have to follow him all the way to Madai. Rashi says, lo nishba lo boy leholech acharav adamati liyadi. He doesn't have to follow him until he returns it to his hands. And so the Gemara says, Mani, who is the author of Mishnah? Lo Rabbi Tarfon. V'lo Rabbi Akiva doesn't seem to follow Rabbi Tarfon, and it doesn't seem to follow Rabbi Akiva. The Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa, the Mesoras Hashas changes it to the Tanan, as we learned in a Mishnah. Gazal echad mechamisha ve'enu yodeya einza mehen. Let's say a person stole from 5 people, but he doesn't know, from one of 5 people rather, but he doesn't know who he stole from. V'chol echad omer osi gazal, and each person says, you stole from me. So the halacha according to Rabbi Tarfon is maniach gezela beineim. He places what he stole between them, umestalik, and then he removes himself. Divrei Rabbi Tarfon, that's the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Akiva says, Lo zu haderech motziyasu midei aver. This is not the proper way to get out of the sin. Ad sheyishalim gezela l'chol echad v'echad. Rather, he has to pay back the gezela to each one. And so the Gemara now says money. So who's the author of our Mishnah? Rabbi Tarfon. If we're following Rabbi Tarfon, Afagav di ishtaba Omar meiniach gezela beineim umistalik. Apparently, according to Rabbi Tarfon, even if he took an oath, he can just place the gezela among them, and he can remove himself. Apparently, he doesn't have to return it to the person. He doesn't have to give it back to the person's hands. And Rabbi Akiva, if you're going to say we're following Rabbi Akiva, Afagav di lo ishtaba, even though he did not take an oath, but still, in the case of the Mishnah, again, Rabbi Akiva was not talking about a false oath, but Omar, he says, Shalim Gezela, he has to actually pay back what was stolen to each one of the individuals. And so therefore it doesn't seem that our Mishnah follows Rabbi Tarfon or Rabbi Akiva. Rashi explains that Shalim he has to pay each one to Hashava liyade bo'inan. The point is, according to Rabbi Akiva, you need to have a Hashava to the person's hand. It's not enough just to put it in front of him. Lomar Mishu Shalo Yitlana, to say that whoever really was the one that owns this, whoever was the one really that I stole it from, should take it. Maniach Gezela, you just place the gezela there according to Rabbi Akiva, rather according to Rabbi Tarfon, you just place the gezela there. V'lo boilam to Eliyade, doesn't need to reach his hand. V'sagi b'meniach lefanim, you just place it in front of him. Sharei bailam shamu, sharei ha-bailam shamu, because the bailam are there, and that's fine. And so therefore, again, it doesn't seem that our Mishnah follows Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon would seem to say in all situations you could just place the gezela down in front. It doesn't actually need to reach their hands, and it doesn't seem to be Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva would say, even in a situation where there was no shvua, apparently it does have to reach the hands of the person. And so the Gemara says, Liolam Rabbi Akiva. Really, Liolam Rabbi Akiva here. Really, the Mishnah is like Rabbi Akiva. And when did Rabbi Akiva say that you have to give the gazelle to each individual? That's actually only where there is an oath. He was only talking about where there was a shvua, again a false shvua. My time, what's the reason? Because the pasuk says, it says he has to actually give it to the person when he's as an atonement for his sin, for his guilt, and so therefore La Asher Hu Lo teaches that he has to actually actually give it to the person's hand. And Rashi says, Liolam Rabbi Akiva, really it is Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva, Meikara Mahadrin and Leukme. Rashi points out, we always like to say, originally at least, that it should be like Rabbi Akiva, Misham Dekulu Tanois Timtoa Alibud Rabbi Akiva Stam, Kedoamar Be'elu Henanachnokin, because in general, when you have Tanoim who are Stam, there's no attribution who it is, they're generally following the position of Rabbi Akiva, and that's why we really are trying to say that the Mishnah follows Rabbi Akiva. And again, we're talking when Rabbi Akiva says you have to give it back to the individual, to his hands, it's talking about when there was a shvuah. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Tarfon. Now Rabbi Tarfon says, Afal gav dishtaba, even if there was a false shvuah, avad rabbanan takanta, still the rabbanan make a takana. There's a special takana from the rabbanan that you actually don't need to return it directly to the person. And Rashi explains, avad rabbanan takanta, the rabbanan made a takana over here according to Rabbi Tarfon, meaning a takana sashavim in this situation where you don't know exactly who you stole from. There's a takana on behalf of those returning the item they stole, that it should be easier, it shouldn't be so difficult for them to return the item. And that's why over here, the Mesaf Galei, where he's not sure who to return it to, Tiskiluhu b'meiniach, it's enough if he just places it in front of them. Kedetani, as we learned in the Brayso, of a takanos gabe gozel, because in general, we make a takana when it comes to somebody who steals, v'nishba v'hoda, and then he takes an oath falsely and he admits, ve'in hanigzal kan, and the person who he stole from is not around, di'ava pidechsiv la'asher hulo, even though it says la'asher hulo, generally, you have to return it straight directly to the person, but Tikkun Rabbanan, the Rabbanan instituted, as we said in our Mishnah, the Neisvei l'shliach bezin, that it's sufficient to give it to the shliach bezin, v'yehei tachas yodim, it should be under their control, at sheyavo nigzal v'yitzlenu, until the nigzal comes and takes it. And just like we make a takana in that situation, so too Rabbi Tarfon makes a takana in this case, as the Gemara here says, the Tani, as we learned in a Brayso, Rabbi Lozer Rabbi Tzadok Omer, Rabbi Lozer Rabbi Tzadok says, takana gedola hiskinu, they made a great takana, shem haisa hotzah yiseir ala keren, that if it costs more money than the principal just to get this back to the person, meshalem keren v'chomesh lebezin, so then the person is allowed to pay the keren and the chomesh to the bezdin, umevi asham u'mischaper lo, and he could bring his carbon asham and have a kapara. And just like we made a takana in that situation, he doesn't have to follow him around the world and spend a lot of money, so too we make a takana in this case. For Rabbi Akiva, now Rabbi Akiva responds to that, of course there is such a thing as a takana, it just doesn't apply all the time. Ki avad rabbanan takanta, when did the rabbanan make a takana? That's heicha diyad leman gazli, that's when at least you know who you're supposed to, who he stole from. To Kamma mamona lemari, where he's returning the money to the owner. Again, eventually it will get to the owner if he leaves it with the bezdin. But gazal echad mechamisha, but in a case where he steals from one of 5 people, delo yada laman gazle, where he doesn't even know who he stole from, delo hadar mamona lemari, that the money is not actually going to get back to the true owner, lo avad rabbanan takanta. There Rabbi Akiva says the rabbanan do not make a takana. Rashi says the Kamma lemari, if the money eventually will get to the owner, la'achar zman, after some time, yachzirenu bezin will return it again. So then we make a takana in that situation. Otherwise, Rabbi Akiva would not make a takana, whereas Rabbi Tarfon would. And we will take a look at Tosas over here to clarify the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon. Meiniach kizei lebeineim u'mistalik. Again, Rabbi Tarfon says he places what he stole among them in a situation where he doesn't know who he stole from, and then he leaves. But Perek HaMafkid muki lo delav davka beineim. And Babba Metziah in Perek HaMafkid, they explain that it doesn't simply mean that he leaves it among them, the shakli lehu kulu v'azli, that they all take it and they can go. Eli yaniach ad sheyisbar hadavar, it just means he places it until they can clarify the situation, miheim habaylim, who actually is the real owner. And the Gemara continues, Meisiv Rav Huna bar Yehuda. Rav Huna bar Yehuda asks the following question. This is a question from a Brayso on what we said above. We said above that the Mishnah could follow Rabbi Akiva, because when Rabbi Akiva says you have to return it to the hands of the Nigzal, he's talking specifically about a case where there was a false oath, like our Mishnah. And the Gemara is now going to ask from this Brayso, because this Brayso is going to indicate that Rabbi Akiva is talking even in a situation where there is no false oath. The Brayso says, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Lo nechliku Rabbi Tarfon Rabbi Akiva, al shalokach echad mechamisha ve'eno yodea me'eza mehen lokach. There's no machlokus, Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, in a case where a person bought something from one of 5 people and he doesn't know who he bought from. Sheminiach dmei mekach beineim u'mistalik. Everybody agrees in that case he can place the money of the purchase among them and he can leave, meaning to say Rabbi Akiva would certainly agree with Rabbi Tarfon in a case of a purchase. Alman nechliku, on what are they arguing? Shegazal echad mechamisha b'nei adam. The case they're arguing about is specifically where he steals from one of 5 people. Ve'eno He doesn't know who he stole from. Rabbi Tarfon says he places the money that he stole among them and he leaves. Rabbi Akiva says that there is no solution unless he pays back what he stole to each individual. And so the Gemara now infers, now if it should enter your mind the ishtaba that Rabbi Akiva is specifically the machlokas between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, and what Rabbi Akiva is saying is specifically when there was a false oath, that's where Rabbi Akiva says he has to pay back to each individual. So mali lokach, mali gazal, what difference does it make if he purchased it and he makes a false oath, or if he stole it and he makes a false oath? That should all be the same. And therefore the fact that they're only arguing by stealing and not by purchasing, it sounds like we're not talking about a situation of a false oath. And further, Mesav Rava asks the following question. There was an incident with one chassid, with a pious individual. He bought from two people. He didn't know who he bought from. He came before Rabbi Tarfon. Amar lo, he said to him, place the money from your purchase among them, and you can remove yourself. Then he came before Rabbi Akiva. Amar lo, he said to him, there is no solution unless you pay back to each individual. That's what he applied in this situation. And so the Gemara says, if it enters your mind to mishtaba that we're talking about a situation of a false oath, if that's what Rabbi Akiva is talking about in this case, chassid mi mishtaba v'shikra, would a pious individual take a false oath? And so therefore again it indicates that what they're talking about is not a situation of a false oath. Now if you're going to say that he took the oath and only later he became a chassid, but that's not true. But we know anytime we say there was an incident with one chassid, or Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, or Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Loi, it's either referring to Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, or it's referring to Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Loi. For Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Loi, Chasidim mei kara havu, and Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava and Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Loi were Chasidim originally, and so therefore we really cannot say, the point over here is we really cannot say the Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva, because it seems like Rabbi Akiva says as halacha, even in a situation where there is no false oath. And Rashi explains, Lo nechliku al shalokach, they're not arguing on a situation of a purchase. This is Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's approach within the machlokas of Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva. They're not arguing on purchases. The kevan deleka isur, because since there was no violation over here, sagi lebahachi, everybody agrees it's enough just to place it in front of them. To lo chsiv la'asher hu lo ela b'makom shechata debay kapara, because la'asher hu lo only applies where there's a sin involved that requires a kapara or requires an atonement. And so the Gemara said, if we're talking about shvua, we wouldn't make that distinction. Ma'ali lokech, what difference does it make if it's a false shvu on a purchase or a false shvu on stealing? Harei nishba l'sheker. At the end of the day, he swore falsely. Ve'ashvu sheker ksiv la'asher hulo. It's about shvu sheker that it says la'asher hulo. Beina gezel, beina tzumes yad, ve'heter asli yad. And again, that pasuk mentions all kinds of issues of owing money, stealing, lending, having a false oath on lending as well. All of those, even in a situation where he originally got the money beheter, that applies. And Rashi also points out, Tana de Chassid Echad, this Tana of the story with the Chassid, Poligad Rav Shimon ben Elazar. It actually argues on Rav Shimon ben Elazar, because again, in the incident with the Chassid Echad, that was actually a case of a purchase. And there was a machlokas Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva over there in a case of a purchase. So you see, there is a machlokas whether the machlokas between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva applies in a case of a purchase or not. That's a machlokas, but in either case, it seems like Rabbi Akiva is saying his halacha, even in a situation where there is no false oath. And so the Gemara instead says, Ella rather liolam Rabbi Tarfon. Really, our Mishnah is Rabbi Tarfon. And again, Rabbi Tarfon does not seem to say that you need to return it to the person's hands. However, umod Rabbi Tarfon hechad ishtaba. Rabbi Tarfon actually would admit that you do need to return it to the person's hands in a situation of a false oath. My time, what's the reason? The Amar Kruk, because the pasuk says, Lasher hu lo yitzanenu biyom ashma. So again, it's a pasuk, and therefore you have to return it directly. For Rabbi Akiva, afagav de lo mishtaba, even in a situation where there was no oath, kanis, he imposes a fine and says you have to return it to the person's hands. But the Gemara continues for Rabbi Tarfon, but according to Rabbi Tarfon, michti, let us see. Heichid mishtab, in a case where there was a false oath, lo sagi de lo hoda, it can't be a case where he didn't admit, because the whole case of these false oaths is talking about where he admits after. So if that's the case, my area v'nishba, why do we have to talk about a situation where there was an oath then? Afila below shvua nami, if you're talking about a case of a hoda, of an admission, even without a shvua, this would be the halacha. The Tanyas we learned in a brayso, moded Rabbi Tarfon admits, but omer l'shnayim gazalti echad mikem, that if a person says to two people, I stole from one of you, mana a mana, ve'eni yodei ezem mikem, and I don't know which one, no sin lozem mana v'lozem mana, so in that case where there's an admission, he gives this one a mana and this one a mana. And Rashi explains, first first Rabbi Tarfon, again, the Mishnah is Rabbi Tarfon, Masnisin the Katani Nishba, the Rabbi Kiva, Afilu lo Nishba Nami. Again, our Mishnah talks about a false oath, so it can't be Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Kiva would say this halacha even when there is no false oath, so the Mishnah must be Rabbi Tarfon. But the Gemara then says Rabbi Tarfon, but if that's the case, according to Rabbi Tarfon, Mechti, let us see. Amasnisin Parach, there's a question on the Mishnah, meaning we're saying that Rabbi Tarfon is the author of the Mishnah, and it's a question on that. Diyamar Nishba in lo Nishba lo, because we're saying only when there's an oath, and when there's no oath, that's not the case. Vukimnak Rabbi Tarfon, and we're saying that the Mishnah is following Rabbi Tarfon. So lo sagi de lo hoda, you can't have a case without an admission. The kapara v'heshav the kra hoda ksiv, because that's what it's talking about when it talks about kapara and returning it. It's talking about when there's a hoda. The ksiv begezel hager v'hisvadu es chatasim. It says that they admit, and so therefore again, if it's a situation where they admit, so then even without a shvua, this should be the case. We will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Dalid Amud Aleph.